Brussels, February 26, 2022. European finance ministers gathered in emergency session. Russian tanks rolled through Ukraine. 7 Russian banks were about to be severed from the global financial system. The Society for Worldwide Interbank. Financial telecommunication, 11,000 banks processing 42 million messages daily. The circulatory system of international finance was being weaponized. Within 16 days, on March 12th, the ban went live. VTB Bank, Bank Odkrytie, Novikombank, Promsvyazbank, Bank Rossia, Sovcombank, and VEB lost their connection to the world. France's finance minister called it a financial nuclear weapon. This was supposed to cripple Russia's economy. This was supposed to force Putin to retreat. This was supposed to demonstrate the absolute power of dollar-based sanctions. It did the opposite. It accelerated the single largest shift in global monetary power since Bretton Woods, not by destroying Russia, by teaching every other nation on earth exactly how vulnerable they are to American financial control. This was not random chaos. This was stage 3 of a 4-stage pattern that destroys every reserve currency in history. The British pound followed it from 1914 to 1944. Pound sterling held 70% of global reserves in 1900. By 1950, it held 10%. 30 years. The mechanisms are identical. Weaponize the currency, drive alternatives, lose monopoly, collapse dominance. The SWIFT ban against Russia in 2022 triggered the exact same cascade that World War I triggered for Britain. Same stages, same timeline, same mathematical certainty of outcome. Before the mechanics of how this destroys dollar dominance, you need to understand why the SWIFT system matters more than military power or economic size. Most analysis focuses on trade flows or GDP numbers. But trade flows only matter when payments can be processed. $1 trillion in exports means nothing if you cannot send the payment instruction. SWIFT is not a payment system. SWIFT is a messaging system. It transmits the instructions that move money between banks. Without SWIFT access, a Russian bank cannot tell a Chinese bank to transfer payment. The Chinese bank receives no authenticated instruction. The transaction cannot complete. This is why SWIFT removal was considered nuclear. It does not freeze assets like traditional sanctions. It severs the communication channel that makes international banking function. The first principle is that sanctions create evasion infrastructure that outlasts the sanctions. When you cut a major economy from the global financial system, that economy does not collapse and surrender. It builds alternative systems. And once those systems exist, they never disappear. They become permanent competitive infrastructure to the dominant system. Iran proved this from 2012 to 2016. The United States and European Union removed Iranian banks from SWIFT in 2012. Iran faced complete financial isolation. Iran did not surrender. Iran built bilateral payment arrangements with Turkey, India, China, and Russia. These arrangements used local currencies, bypassing dollars entirely. When sanctions partially lifted in 2016, the infrastructure remained. Iranian oil trades continued in non-dollar currencies because the systems existed and worked. Russia replicated this pattern, but at vastly larger scale. Russia had been preparing since 2014 when the United States first threatened SWIFT removal after Crimea's annexation. Russia built the system for transfer of financial messages, its domestic alternative to SWIFT. By 2022, over 400 Russian banks used NSPFS. When the SWIFT ban hit in March 2022, Russian financial infrastructure did not collapse. It pivoted. Russia and China connected their payment systems within weeks. The People's Bank of China and the Central Bank of Russia linked SPFS to China's cross-border interbank payment system. Russian companies could now send payment instructions to Chinese banks without touching SWIFT or dollars. The infrastructure was operational by April 2022. The scale exploded beyond sanctions evasion into permanent alternative architecture. Rus-IA China trade in 2021 used dollars for 75% of transactions. By December 2023, 95% of Russia-China trade settled in rubles or yuan. By November 2025, 99.1% used national currencies, according to Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov. This was not just Russia and China. Russia began settling energy sales to India in rupees. Russia traded with Mongolia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore using yuan. The SWIFT ban forced construction of a parallel financial system handling hundreds of billions in annual trade flows without dollars. Modern nations face identical pressure. Every country watching Russia's isolation asks the same question. If the United States can weaponize SWIFT against Russia today, can it weaponize SWIFT against us tomorrow? This fear drives de-dollarization faster than any economic logic. Saudi Arabia, a 75-year American ally, moved toward yuan-denominated oil sales in 2023. Brazil and Argentina, traditional dollar users, began accepting yuan for Chinese imports in 2023. India opened special Vostro accounts, allowing trade settlement in rupees with 22 countries, including Russia, UAE, and Germany by 2023. The common thread is not anti-American ideology. The common thread is diversification away from systems that can be weaponized. The second principle is that reserve currency status requires trust, and weaponization destroys trust permanently. The dollar became the global reserve currency through Bretton Woods in 1944 because the United States offered stability and non-interference. Countries held dollars because dollars were safe, liquid, and apolitical. The implicit deal was that America would not use dollar dominance as a geopolitical weapon. Sanctions against specific entities or individuals were one thing. Cutting entire countries from the dollar payment system broke that implicit deal. It revealed that dollars are not neutral. Dollars are tools of American foreign policy. The numbers showed trust erosion in real time. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves stood at 72% in 2001. By 2015, it recovered to 65% after the financial crisis. Then came escalating sanctions. By 2022, the dollar's share dropped to 58%. By the end of 2024, it fell to 57.8%, the lowest since 1994. 7.3 percentage points declined in just 10 years. This is not currency substitution toward the euro or yen. Those shares remained flat, around 20% and 6%. The decline went toward non-traditional currencies: Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, Chinese yuan, South Korean won, Swedish krona. Central banks are diversifying into anything that is not the dollar. China is the most aggressive diversifier. China held approximately $1.3 trillion in United States Treasury securities in November 2013. By July 2025, China's holdings dropped to $730 billion, a 45% reduction. At the same time, China's gold reserves doubled from 1,100 tons in 2015 to 2,300 tons in 2024. China is systematically exiting dollar assets and entering hard assets immune to sanctions. The People's Bank of China bought gold for 11 consecutive months through September 2025. Other central banks followed the same playbook. Global central bank gold purchases hit 1,083 tons in 2022, the highest since records began. The first half of 2023 saw 387 tons purchased. This is not investment diversification. This is insurance against dollar weaponization. The pattern is identical to Britain's pound sterling decline. Britain weaponized sterling through trade restrictions and exchange controls during World War I. Countries responded by holding dollars and gold instead of pounds. Britain's reserve currency share collapsed from 55% in 1950 to essentially zero by 1970. The mechanisms driving de-dollarization today are identical to the mechanisms that destroyed sterling. Weaponize your currency, watch countries flee, lose reserve status. The third principle is that alternative payment systems gain network effects once they reach critical mass. Payment systems follow network theory. The value of a network increases exponentially with users. SWIFT dominated because 11,000 banks used it. No alternative could compete because no alternative had the network. The SWIFT ban changed this calculation by forcing a critical mass of users onto alternatives immediately. Russia's economy represents roughly 2% of global GDP, but Russia is the world's largest gas exporter and a top 3 oil exporter. Every country buying Russian energy had to develop non-SWIFT payment methods. China's CIPS system handled 2,800 participating banks by 2024, with transactions denominated in yuan. The system processed over 100 trillion yuan in 2023, approximately $14 trillion equivalent. India's Vostro account system allowed rupee settlement with 22 countries without dollar conversion. UAE and India completed the first crude oil transaction in rupees in August 2023 under local currency settlement framework. Brazil and China signed a currency swap agreement allowing direct real yuan exchange without dollar intermediation. Every bilateral arrangement reduces dollar necessity. More critically, these arrangements create infrastructure that makes future non-dollar transactions cheaper and easier. Network effects begin favoring alternatives. The yuan's rise is most dramatic. In February 2022, the yuan represented less than 2% of global trade finance. By February 2023, the yuan's share reached 4.5%. As of March 2024, over 52.9% of Chinese payments globally settled in yuan, while 42.8% settled in dollars. The yuan is not replacing the dollar globally, but it is replacing the dollar in specific trade corridors, and each corridor that shifts creates precedent and infrastructure for others to follow. Russia-China energy trade demonstrates the complete transition. Before 2022 sanctions, Russia sold natural gas and oil to China in dollars. Payment went through SWIFT. Russian banks held dollars to facilitate these transactions. By 2024, essentially 100% of Russia-China energy trade settled in rubles and yuan. Payment flows through CIPS and SPFS. Russian banks hold $68.7 billion in yuan and only $64.7 billion in dollars by December 2023. The entire energy relationship, worth over $240 billion annually, exited the dollar system. This is structural change, not temporary sanctions workaround. The fourth principle is that reserve currency dominance concentrates in the issuing country's financial system, and alternatives dilute that concentration permanently. Dollar dominance means the world needs dollars, so the world holds dollar assets, predominantly United States Treasury securities. Foreign holdings of treasuries enable massive American government borrowing at low rates. This is the exorbitant privilege. America imports goods, exports dollars, and other countries finance American deficits by holding treasuries. The system breaks when countries need fewer dollars. Total foreign holdings of dollar-denominated reserves stood at roughly $6.63 trillion at the end of 2024, down from $6.69 trillion in 2023. The decline is small in absolute terms, but significant in trajectory. For the first time in decades, foreign dollar reserve holdings fell. Despite global reserves growing, total reserves across all currencies reached $12.36 trillion. The dollar's share declined not because the world holds fewer reserves, but because the world deliberately holds fewer dollars. Central banks accumulated gold and diversified into non-traditional currencies. This reduces demand for treasuries. The United States federal government borrows over $1 trillion annually. Declining foreign treasury demand means either domestic buyers absorb the difference, which is impossible at current scales, or interest rates rise to attract buyers. Higher rates increase debt service costs, which increases future borrowing, which requires even higher rates. The cycle is unsustainable without foreign treasury buyers. China's treasury holdings dropping from $1.3 trillion to $730 billion removes $600 billion in demand. That is $600 billion the United States must find elsewhere. Every country following China's playbook, buying gold instead of treasuries, tightens this vice. Britain faced identical dynamics from 1945 to 1970. Britain needed foreign holders of sterling to finance its deficits. As sterling's reserve status declined, foreign holdings evaporated. Britain faced recurring sterling crises requiring International Monetary Fund bailouts. Britain was forced to devalue sterling repeatedly, driving further flight from the currency. The cycles fed on itself until sterling was irrelevant as a reserve currency. The United States has not reached crisis yet, but the mechanism is in motion. Now here is what everyone misses. The SWIFT ban was tactically successful in isolating Russia, but strategically catastrophic for dollar hegemony. Russia's economy faced severe recession in 2022. Ruble volatility spiked, import prices exploded, but within 18 months, Russia stabilized through alternative payment channels. Meanwhile, the demonstration effect rippled across every non-Western country. The message was clear. Dollar access is conditional, not guaranteed. SWIFT access is conditional, not guaranteed. Your reserves can be frozen. Your banks can be isolated. The only insurance is building alternatives before you need them. BRICS expansion directly responds to this fear. The original 5 BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, added Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAEs in 2024. Over 40 additional countries expressed interest or formally applied for membership. If all applicants joined, BRICS would represent 71% of the world's population and over 50% of global GDP measured by purchasing power parity. The explicitly stated goal is reducing dollar dependence. At the August 2023 BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, leaders committed to increasing use of local currencies for cross-border trade and developing alternatives to dollar-dominated systems. Russian President Vladimir Putin stated in August 2023 that de-dollarization is a balanced and irreversible process. Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized creating fair and balanced financial infrastructure, not controlled by any single nation. Brazilian President Lula da Silva questioned why trade must use dollars when both trading partners hold different currencies. These statements from leaders representing 3 billion people signal geopolitical intent to end dollar monopoly. The SWIFT ban gave them common cause and urgency. The pattern is screaming what comes next. These 4 principles, sanctions infrastructure, trust erosion, network effects, and reserve concentration, operate in sequence for Britain from World War I through the Bretton Woods collapse. The timeline was 30 years from first weaponization in 1914 to complete reserve currency transition by 1944. The SWIFT ban represents year 2 of weaponization on March 12, 2022. 30 years forward, project's full transition completing by 2052. But modern technology and communication accelerate everything. The sterling collapse took decades because building alternative payment systems required physical infrastructure, correspondent banking networks, and slow diplomatic negotiations. Modern alternatives deploy in months. CIPES scaled to handle trillions in annual volume within 3 years of serious international adoption. Currency swap lines activate immediately through central bank digital systems. The realistic timeline is 15 to 20 years for major dollar share loss, not 30. The dollar will not disappear. Sterling still exists 50 years after losing reserve status. But sterling is irrelevant. Britain is a normal country with a normal currency. The same future awaits the dollar. By 2040, the dollar likely holds 40 to 45% of global reserves instead of 58% today. That 13 to 18 percentage point shift means over $1 trillion in reduced treasury demand. Every trillion less in foreign treasury purchases requires interest rates 1 to 2 percentage points higher to attract domestic buyers. This feeds back into faster de-dollarization, as higher American rates make dollar assets less attractive. China wins massively. China is systematically positioning the yuan as the primary alternative for Asian, African, and Latin American trade. China offers currency swap lines to 41 countries worth $480 billion as of March 2023. China prices increasing shares of its massive imports, especially energy and raw materials, in yuan rather than dollars. Every country holding yuan reserves to buy Chinese goods shifts away from dollars. China's financial system gains the advantages America enjoyed for 70 years. Chinese government borrowing costs drop as foreign yuan demand rises. China exports yuan, imports goods, and gets paid to do it. The United States imposed this on itself by weaponizing the dollar so aggressively that China could position the yuan as the safer alternative. Dollar-dependent American consumers lose. Reduced foreign treasury demand means higher interest rates. Higher rates mean more expensive mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and student loans. The average American household pays thousands more annually in debt service. Higher rates slow economic growth, reducing job creation and wage increases. The federal government pays hundreds of billions more in interest on national debt, forcing spending cuts or tax increases. All of this traces back to one decision: cutting Russia from SWIFT to punish Ukrainian invasion. Countries holding massive dollar reserves lose. Japan holds over $1 trillion in treasuries. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Gulf states collectively hold trillions more. As the dollar's share declines, these assets lose value relative to alternatives. Currency diversification means selling treasuries, which pushes prices down and rates up, which makes remaining holdings worth less. These countries face a prisoner's dilemma. Everyone benefits if no one sells, but if others sell first, you lose more by holding. This creates cascade risk where gradual de-dollarization accelerates into panic selling. The same dynamic destroyed sterling in the 1960s. The four-principle pattern has destroyed every reserve currency in history. Weaponized through sanctions and financial isolation. Watch trust evaporate and alternatives emerge. Reach critical mass where network effects favor alternatives. Lose reserve concentration and face borrowing crisis. The British pound, the Dutch guilder, the Spanish silver dollar before that. Every reserve currency follows this path from dominance to irrelevance. The mechanism is economics, not politics. Once alternatives provide sufficient liquidity and stability, inertia breaks. The tipping point is when holding alternatives becomes safer than holding the dominant currency, because the dominant currency has become a weapon. The SWIFT ban against Russia in March 2022 was not just another sanction. This was crossing the Rubicon of financial weaponization. Freezing specific Russian oligarch accounts or banning specific Russian entities is targeted punishment. Severing 7 Russian banks from the global payment system while Russia is the world's largest gas exporter. And a top 3 oil exporter forced every country importing Russian energy to build alternative payment infrastructure. That infrastructure now exists. It will not disappear when Ukraine war ends. It will expand because it works, and because it reduces dependence on a system that can be weaponized. The timeline says we have 7 to 10 years before inflection. The dollar share dropped 7.3 percentage points from 2015 to 2024. At this rate, the dollar falls below 50% of reserves by 2033. 50% is critical. Below 50%, the dollar is not the dominant reserve currency. It is merely one option among several. That psychological shift triggers portfolio reallocation at massive scale. Once the dollar loses majority status, the remaining share declines faster because the rationale for holding dollars, universal acceptance and liquidity, weakens. If everyone else is diversifying, you must diversify. The cascade begins. This is not prediction. This is pattern recognition. These 4 principles played out exactly this way for every prior reserve currency. And the pattern is screaming that we are in stage 3 of 4. Stage 1 was dollar weaponization through expanding sanctions from 2001 through 2022. Stage 2 was swift removal, creating critical mass for alternatives in 2022. Stage 3 is network effect acceleration as alternative systems reach scale, happening now through 2030. Stage 4 is cascade as dollar concentration breaks and foreign reserve holders flee, projected 2030 through 2040. The only question is whether markets will adapt gradually or whether a crisis forces sudden adjustment. Gradual decline means slowly rising interest rates and inflation. Crisis means treasury market breakdown, sharp dollar devaluation, and potential sovereign debt crisis. If this showed you that swift removal was not just tactical punishment, but strategic self-destruction, if you understand now that reserve currency status depends on trust more than military power, if you see that de-dollarization is irreversible once alternative infrastructure reaches critical mass, then follow the pattern because the next stage of dollar decline will determine whether America remains prosperous or descends into inflation and austerity. The SWIFT ban accelerated the largest monetary power shift in 75 years, not by destroying Russia's economy, but by teaching the world it needs alternatives to the dollar. And once the world builds those alternatives, the dollar era ends. The only question is whether the transition takes 15 years or 5. The pattern says we are already halfway there.